Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Edwards, and I'm the executive director of the Global Game Jam. And I'm also a 27 plus year veteran of the game industry, being a geographer who does culturalization work in the industry. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. I'd like to talk about mental health and why this is important and how it affects us, and how our mental health is affected by the process of creating games. In addition to my roles, my professional roles, I'm also on the board of TakeThis.org, which deals with mental health in the game industry. And I'm also a patron of Safe in Our World, which is a UK-based nonprofit, which also focuses on mental health in the game industry. And so, why is this so important? Why is this something we should be talking about? Why is it something that we should be focusing on? Well, I think if anything, just the 2020 and the pandemic alone has shown what can affect our mental health and how our mental health can be disrupted in such a big way, even by something like a public health crisis, as we've been experiencing. But on top of that, we also have the activity of actually creating games and being in the game industry, which also creates its own level of mental health stress. And so this is something I'd like to talk about. One of the things that often gets discussed um, in our different conversations with each other, and all these stories we hear throughout the industry about people being laid off because the company went under, or they basically how game studios manage their contract workers. We hear about crunch hours. We hear about companies that work people over way beyond what would be considered normal hours for most jobs outside of the game industry. And, we hear all of these other stories about what happens when our frontline people, like community managers and people managing our company's social media, have to deal with the toxicity online and all of the other issues that come up with that. And it takes a tremendous toll on people. And so these stories are out there, or the sexist environments that we are very aware of that happen in a lot of different companies, even some this year where we've had some major news about certain companies where their internal culture turned out to be a lot more toxic and a lot more negative than people were ever guessing. And so we hear these things all the time, and all of these stories build up for ourselves as people who create games a certain negativity, a certain weight that's upon us, not just obviously physical weight, but the mental weight, all of these things that we think about. And the scary part to me is that when I deal with a lot of young people who are wanting to get into the game industry, such as this young woman who wrote me about a year ago. And this is what she said. She heard all of these stories, like a lot of the stories I was just showing. And she said, right now, I'm mainly afraid what future awaits me. And what she meant was that she's afraid of, going into the game industry and finding herself in a situation where her mental health and her well-being are going to be so negatively impacted, even though, like many of us, or like all of us in the game industry, she has this tremendous passion for making games, and it's something that she wants to do very badly. However, she sees all these stories, and she has a fear of what's going to happen to her as a person, and as in the overall mental health of who she is. And this is a concern a lot of people I know share. She's absolutely not alone. And so in this talk, I want to discuss this a bit more. Now, my history in the game industry, like I said, I've been around a long time. I've also been in pretty public advocacy roles, like running the International Game Developers Association and currently running the Global Game Jam. And I've had the great privilege and honor to be able to travel all over the world, including to Prague last year when I spoke at GDS last year, and meeting with developers and getting to hear their stories and hear what their struggles are and hear their successes. And one of the common themes that I've heard all around the world through developers, no matter where they are, is the issue of mental health and how they feel this impact of mental health. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, and also one of the reasons why I give my time to help these organizations like Take This and Safe in Our World, because I know it's such a very important issue to so many people in this industry. The problem is that we just don't talk about it enough. So what is one of the most common concerns I hear from all these developers? Well, as I said, it's their mental health and the long-term impact of what's happening in the industry and what happens in their job and how that impacts their mental health. So, on a global scale, 1 in 5 people will be diagnosed with some kind of mental health issue in every year. That's a lot of people. That's 20% of the population are diagnosed with some kind of mental health issue, and in their lifetime, 1 in 2 people are likely to be diagnosed. So about 50% of the human population. So this is another thing where you wonder why we don't talk about this as much when it is so common. It's like almost everyone around you or every other person around you is dealing with some kind of issue, and yet we as a society, we're not very open about this, and we certainly are not very open about it in the game industry, but that is changing. There's 3 key factors, though, that have been identified that really affect game developer health more than anything else. And these were outlined in this document that came out last year, the State of the Industry 2019, which was a white paper created by takethis.org, which I highly recommend you read because it has fantastic details in there. But I'm going to present some of their top findings and basically tell you what were those 3 key factors that affect game developer mental health. So the first one this is probably not a secret. So the first one is the lack of job stability and longevity. So the inability to feel like they're going to be in their job, no matter where they work, they feel like they're not going to be there for a long time. So is this the case? Well, data has shown from various surveys that have been done with game developers that feeling is true, that the working conditions, as I think many of us know in the game industry, are not very stable. You can see in the upper right there, that statistic that 24% of game developers, so 1 in 4 people, worked for 3 to 5 different employers in the last 5 years. That is a lot of turnover. That is a lot of job churn. That is a lot of relocating. It's a lot of disruption to your life. If you have that many jobs in only 5 years, that's just one example. Also down there in the lower right, 53% report that crunch is often expected, which is working more than 60 hours a week. And that is a huge demand on a lot of people's lives, especially if you have a partner, if you have children, if you have other responsibilities other than work, then it makes life very difficult. And of course, that puts a lot of stress on us. And only 46% of people reported that they feel there's a clear path to advancement in the job that they have. So less than half of people think that they feel like they have a future in the job that they're currently in. So all of these factors together create a pretty negative outlook. You can quickly understand how people would have that negative perception. Common stress points, of course, are crunch. We hear that a lot. There's crunch doesn't happen everywhere, of course. It tends to be more of a geographic phenomenon. We hear a lot in North America, a lot in East Asia. In Europe, not quite as much, even though, yes, people crunch in Europe as well. But part of the difference is that a lot of European countries have stronger labor laws that prevent crunch from happening. Whereas in the US here, we really don't have those kind of labor laws. The role of employees on social media. So how do you separate who you are as a person from your job versus your personal life and how that represents on social media? Because oftentimes gamers out there, they're going to talk to you no matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're on your work account or on your personal account. So there's really no separation. Competitive workplaces. We know that the game industry is a very competitive place. People work, very hard. It's often difficult to get a job in this industry. And also the job stability factor, of course, like I mentioned before, where there's a lot of turnover at companies, or a lot of people, they face the reality that as soon as they're done on this game project, then they expect to be laid off, or they expect to possibly, have their hours reduced or some other issue, impact them. And of course, along with that is the job and location changes, because that can be extremely stressful. That's even if you're just, like I said before, if that's just you alone. But if you have a family or if you have a partner, then that creates even more stress and detriment to your mental health. And of course, unfairness too, that we see in the workplace from various practices. So, a while back when we asked developers if they thought that crunch is a necessary part of game development, 53% said they disagreed or strongly disagreed with that idea. And yet we still see it happening in the industry quite a bit. You know, and it's interesting because in most other industries outside of games, crunch is usually called poor project management. It means that you're not able to project manage correctly and efficiently and actually know how to manage people's time well. And so that's often an issue that falls back on the producers and the project managers in these different companies. Back a few years ago, this project called the Games Outcome Project, one of the things that was most alarming is that they found that game developers that reported high rates of crunch on projects also reported decreased return on their investment. So they didn't get back as much money on the game as they expected. And even worse, they had lower Metacritic scores for the resulting product, which basically is the exact opposite of why management often tells you to crunch. They say, well, we're going to make the game better. It's going to be a better product and more people are going to like it. But actual data shows that it's the opposite, that actually it causes more problems than it solves. And so this is something I think a lot of people need to look at very closely when crunch practices are used. There's another white paper I highly recommend on the Take This website called Crunch Hurts. This is a white paper from 4 years ago in 2016. But what's great about it is that it outlines very clearly the physiological and mental health impact of doing crunch as a practice. And so I recommend you take a look at this. And it's not a surprise as a result of all of these factors, the job turnover, the lack of stability, the existence of crunch, is that opinions about unionizing in the industry have actually increased over the last several years. You can see here these data points from the IGDA survey that we did way back when. You know, so 32% in 2009 said they were in support of unionization, but that went up 5 years later to 56% in 2014, and then 66% in 2017. And then in last year, in 2019, it was up to 73% said yes or maybe to the idea of unionizing in the game industry. And people wonder, well, why is the support growing so much? Well, a lot of it, again, is because of working conditions. And I hear this all over the world. Everywhere I travel, I hear this complaint constantly. And so it's not a surprise to me at all that I think for a lot of developers, they see unions as a way to help control the out of control working conditions and to help put some pressure on management to treat their talent with more, you know, respect and to actually treat them as human beings. So, and this is not to say all companies do this. There are many great companies in the game industry around the world, but we still know there's a lot of companies that use these practices that can be problematic for employees. The second issue we need to think about, which the study showed that impacts mental health on game developers, is the lack of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And so for some people, this is not an obvious point, but let me explain a little bit further. So when we asked in a survey a couple years ago, do you feel there's equal treatment and opportunity for everyone in the game industry? And you can see here that the majority of people said no. They don't think there's equal opportunity. And that's troubling. That's concerning when we see that many people feeling that way, that they don't think that there's equal opportunity. But when we ask them, how important do you feel is diversity in the workplace? And by that question, we mean diversity in any workplace, just diversity in general. Do you think it's good to have a diverse workplace? And 75% of the respondents said that they thought it was very important or somewhat important. But then when they were asked specifically about diversity in the game industry workplace, it was 79%, so a little bit higher. So there's a huge amount of support. And this survey, by the way, was the respondents were 80% male responding to this survey. So it's not just women and underrepresented people saying that diversity is important. This is basically a huge cross the demographic, a lot of people who believe that this is important value, and we're not seeing it reflected in the game industry. So people say it's important, but the data shows that people don't think that it exists at the moment. So just by contrast, in the United States, currently about 45% of game players are women. So roughly about half of game players are women. And we know this is pretty much true around the world for the most part, but then only 21% of game creators are women. So we have this big gap between those who create games and those who play games. And we know that those who play games represent pretty much every possible demographic on Earth, every cultural background, religious background, ethnic background, gender background. And so we know that games are something that human beings do on a global scale. However, those who make games represent still a very narrow demographic, which tends to be male and it tends to be white, depending on where you are. But certainly in North America and in Europe, that tends to be the case. So there's desire to see that change, because the more diversity we have in the workplace, we have the chance of making games that appeal to the people who are already playing those games, the diverse players out there and the diverse gamers. So another problem that we've seen also in the game industry is the existence of a gender wage gap. As you can see here, unfortunately, this data is 6 years old because this was the last time a salary survey was done. But you can see the disparity here. The average salary difference is pretty high, by 11,000 euro on average. Now the smallest gap in the job type was in game design, but the largest gap was in audio engineers. So, and this is basically for people doing the same job. So is this concerning? Yeah, it is, because people basically, if you're doing the same job, it shouldn't matter what your gender is. It shouldn't matter what your color is. You should basically get paid the same amount. And this is something, again, that can have an impact on your mental health and on the workplace. So the third issue that also impacts a lot of people's mental health is the public perception of games. So how exactly are games perceived by the general public and by the people around us as we're going about doing our work? So we hear about this all the time, we, especially in the United States, because we have this problem with guns and the access to guns, and we have a lot of gun violence in the United States. So anytime there's a major shooting, everyone, especially in the media, they immediately ask, what kind of game was the shooter playing? Yeah, and they ask it all the time. And so they automatically blame video games for being the source of the violence. And we know from various studies that this is not true. This has been debunked. But what I see whenever I hear this argument, whenever I hear a government official, whether it's in the US or some other country, when I see them calling out video games as the source of violence or the source of some other social problem, I think that's a failure on the game industry's part. We have not done a good enough job in basically helping them understand who we are and what we do. And this is in contrast to a lot of other creative media out there, because most people know how films are made, for example. It's not a secret how films are made, and films are allowed to have content of all different types, really violent films, really nice films, there's all kinds of things, but games are still perceived in a very narrow band of what games are capable of doing. Whereas we in the industry know that games have a tremendous potential for evoking emotion and exploring ideas and concepts that can be very adult and can be very serious. And we're only beginning to scratch the surface of what the potential of video games. So, but this perception issue, it creates a negative impact on us, because we going to work every day, whether currently working from home or however we're working, having that feeling that we are being vilified, having that feeling that we are seen negatively by people in the public or government officials, for a lot of people that's something that negatively affects their mental health, and it doesn't feel good to feel like your job is seen in a negative way. So, so again, we see these stories all the time. It happens every time, at least here in the US. But oftentimes, if there is a shooting somewhere else outside the US, we see the same kind of thing where politicians and law enforcement, they automatically try and figure out like what kind of game was this person playing. It's obvious from this chart. When we had a shooting last year, a couple of shootings in the United States, this chart was making its going around on social media, and you can see, violent gun deaths in the US versus video game revenue. Well, I mean, obviously, if games were the source of violence, then all of these other countries would also have a problem with violent gun deaths, but they don't. So what's the problem there? Well, I think you can kind of guess for yourself. The problem is not the games. The problem is the access to the weapons. So what's interesting is that in 2011, the US Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, they basically decided that video games are free speech, that they qualify for First Amendment protection, which is an amazing milestone for, at least for games in the United States. But a lot of other countries looked at this decision as a huge marker for video games, as a positive sign, because if the Supreme Court of the United States is willing to state that video games are free speech, and they also found that there's no link between violent games and its effect on children, this was a huge, huge milestone for the game industry. So, and so that was a victory that we celebrated, and we still celebrate that. However, what's interesting is that just a few years after that, they did a research study in the US, and they found that adults in the US, 40% believe that there's a relationship between games and violence. Even though that's never been absolutely proven. There's studies that say the opposite. Even the Supreme Court, some of the smartest people in the US, usually, but they, even they found that there was no compelling connection. So, and yet the perception in the public remains that games have something to do with violence. Just like 26% of adults, they thought that games are a waste of time. Or 60% believe that most people who play games are men, which we know is not true. You know, that there's, like I said before, there's about gender parity, about equal in terms of who plays video games. A lot of people don't even know, for example, that there are more women in their 30s and 40s who play video games than teen males who play video games. And when I often quote that statistic to somebody I meet in the public, they think I'm lying. They can't believe it, because that's not what they hear in the media. And that's not what they hear reinforced constantly by politicians and by the media. And so it creates, again, this kind of negative image of the industry that persists. And that, again, is something that we, as people in the industry, we hear this, we see it, we're not blind to it. And so we hear this kind of feedback, and it is negative, and that weighs on us. And also, lastly, 23% of these adults thought that video games do not promote teamwork and communication, which is kind of funny, because that, they obviously haven't played a game in the last 5 or 10 years, because most of the most popular games require teamwork, they require communication. So it's kind of funny. This kind of also illustrates how people are out of touch to a certain degree. So one of the things I think is really important for us as game developers to remember is that games are basically what video games represent, are the current evolution of human narrative. So basically games are the current way that we are figuring out, how do we convey story from one generation to another? How do we take stories, how do we take experiences, and are we able to communicate those to other people, both now and in other generations in the future? And all of these other forms of media that you see here, visual arts, language, writing, and so on, these are all various forms of communication that human beings have created throughout our history. And all of these are still used today, and they're all used in different creative ways. But games are currently at the forefront. We are leading this whole change, and we are integrating the creative media, just like film and television and all that have done. We are integrating it with technology in a way that's never been done before. Now, to me, that's super exciting. That puts us in a very unique position, that we are changing a lot of things. We're changing the way people spend their time. We're changing the way people play with each other. We're changing the way people have experiences. And most importantly, in my opinion, and I know a lot of people in the industry share this opinion, is that games are an empathy engine. So basically, we, unlike all of these other forms of media, we have the most potential for putting someone in the experience of another person and having them understand through empathy what it's like to be in that position, whether it's a real world situation or a fantasy situation or whatever it is. Now, I think this is something we need to embrace and really understand this, because I think it gives us a certain confidence and it gives us a certain power that we need to understand. Also, what's really important is all realizing, as I think many of us in the industry do, we know that games are also the largest form of entertainment on earth. And it's been that way for quite a few years now. Now, this chart is from revenue from 3 years ago, but the proportions are what I'm really trying to show. And the proportions are still the same as they were before. Now, you can see here from this chart is that games make more money than all of these other forms of creative media. And that's pretty amazing. But what's even more amazing, if you take every form of live sports on earth, like FIFA and the NFL, the Major League Baseball, cricket, all these other forms of sport, you combined all of those, and video games still make more money than the entire form of live sports around the world. That's a staggering amount of money. It's amazing how much video games have grown and how they continue to grow, even despite having the economic, problems that the world had a few years ago, about 10 years ago, and some of the other problems. Even during COVID, during the pandemic, a lot of game companies have seen record revenue because what are people doing when they're locked down at home? They can't go to the movie theater, so a lot of people are playing games. And so that shows a certain kind of resiliency that video games have that other forms of media may not have. And that's not for us to be arrogant about. It's not for something for us to gloat over, but it's just something as game creators to embrace the fact that what we are doing is important. And what we're doing is changing the world, especially in the forms of entertainment and narrative. And this is something that should make us proud as game developers, so that public perception issue, even though we hear the negative feedback, we see the negative stories, we hear politicians say stuff from sometimes, but we know that, eventually that's going to go away, because every major form of media that has ever been created by human beings, it always went through this kind of initial phase of rejection, and eventually it becomes accepted. So just think, within another 10 or 15 years, every single politician on earth will have grown up with video games. So I don't think we're going to be seeing a bunch of laws being created that are anti-game and trying to regulate game industries in different countries. I think we're going to see a much more liberal, open-minded attitude. And I think, again, that's going to help us as game creators. So there is hope that, there are things that are changing in this industry. So I'm not trying to paint a negative picture, but, what I'm trying to highlight is the fact that we need to be thinking about our mental health. We need to be conscious of it. And more importantly, we need to communicate with each other about it. Because, for example, if you came into work when we used to go into work, but if you went into work on a Monday with a broken leg, what happens? You would get a lot of outpouring of sympathy from people, because they could see you had a broken leg. And so they'd be offering to help you. They'd be wondering what's wrong. But if you come into work on a Monday morning and you tell people, I just don't feel like working, and people don't know what to say, because there's nothing obvious why. Like if you're having chronic depression or you're dealing with anxiety and you feel like you just can't work, that is okay, but we need to talk about it. We need people to understand why that's the case, because that state of mind, having depression or whatever else you might be dealing with, is no different from walking into work, coming into work on crutches on a broken leg. It's still something that negatively impacts us. And so we need to talk about it and be open about it. So one of the things that we're seeing is more and more companies changing policies, more companies that are committing to low or no crunch, who are committing to having more diverse environments. Some companies have a no layoff model. So when they hire people, they do their best to keep people on the company as much as they can. Like the company Vuga in Berlin, they have a very, very strong focus on mental wellness and health among all their employees. So they make that a huge priority for their workplace. And so there's a lot of other companies doing this. And so this is great. I mean, we see that more and more companies in the game industry are taking it very seriously. And so one of the things I would encourage you to do, if you're an indie developer, if you have a very small studio, this is the time to make these decisions. This is when you set the right tone, and this is when you set the right policy for making sure that everyone is able to be supported and they can be heard, and so they can be understood. So the mental health issues are part of the workplace, and you take those into consideration and don't just ignore them. And what's great, like I mentioned before, is there are organizations out there that are trying to change this and trying to change the negative stigma around mental health, and they're trying to be more open about it, like Take This and Safe in Our World. And there's also the International Games Summit on Mental Health that just took place last month, which is based out of Toronto. So there's all of these efforts that are happening. So there are great resources out there. So I really encourage you that if you feel like this is something that is affecting you personally, or you know of people who this could be affecting, I encourage you to go to these websites and check them out, because there's a lot of great resources there. And there's a lot of great strategy resources too for how you can help your workplace be better, and how you can help people in the workplace understand this impact. Because I think, again, ultimately, the more we talk about it, the more we're open about it, the better the situation is going to be. So with that, I thank you very much for listening.